A humble black man named Marcus never thought that stopping to help a stranded woman on the side of the road would lead to anything more than a simple thank you. But when he changed her flat tire that night, he unknowingly set off a chain of events that would turn his quiet world upside down. The next morning, a sleek black SUV appeared outside his house, watching, waiting. Who were they? What did they want from him? And how did one act of kindness pull Marcus into a life he never saw coming? Let's dive into this gripping tale of fate, power, and unexpected consequences. But before we begin, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you love stories filled with mystery and life-altering moments, don't forget to subscribe. In the heart of the quiet rural town of Maple Creek, where the early morning mist rolled over vast stretches of farmland, a man named Ethan Harper had built a life of simplicity. The town itself, with its narrow winding roads, rustic houses, and a single main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, was the kind of place where everybody knew each other. There were no towering skyscrapers, no heavy traffic, just the sound of birds in the morning, the rhythmic creak of rocking chairs on porches, and the distant hum of tractors in the fields. It was the kind of town where life moved at its own unhurried pace, and for Ethan, that was just the way he liked it. At 35, Ethan Harper had settled into his role as the town's maintenance technician at the Maple Creek Community Center. Every morning, he would arrive at sunrise, his toolbox slung over one shoulder, ready to fix whatever needed repairing, be it leaky pipes, faulty wiring, or a broken playground swing. His work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, and it brought him a quiet sense of fulfillment. He enjoyed the routine, the predictability, and most of all, the sense of purpose that came with helping others. Ethan had always been a man of quiet strength. He wasn't one for long conversations, nor was he the type to seek attention. He preferred to work in the background, fixing things without fanfare, ensuring that the community center remained a welcoming place for the town's children, the elderly, and everyone in between. His hands were calloused from years of labor, his clothes always had traces of grease or paint, and yet, there was something undeniably steady about him, something that made people trust him without question. The community center itself was more than just a building to Ethan. It was a second home. It was where children gathered after school for tutoring sessions, where local farmers held meetings, where the elderly came for their weekly bingo nights. It was the beating heart of Maple Creek, and Ethan made sure it ran smoothly. Despite his strong connection to the town, Ethan lived alone. His modest house, a small but sturdy cabin nestled at the edge of town near the river, was a reflection of his personality, simple, functional, and unpretentious. A single porch light flickered to life at dusk, and his old truck sat parked out front, a relic from his younger years that he stubbornly refused to replace. Ethan had no family left in Maple Creek. His parents had passed away years ago, and while he had no siblings, he never truly felt lonely. The town itself had become his family, and he took solace in the small moments, the smiles of the children he helped, the grateful nods from elders when he fixed their heating, the laughter of the townspeople echoing through the community center's halls. But while Ethan had built a life that was steady and predictable, there was an undercurrent of something deeper within him, an unspoken longing for something more. He wouldn't admit it, perhaps not even to himself, but sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, as he sat on his porch listening to the crickets, he wondered if there was something else out there for him. Something beyond Maple Creek. Something that would shake up the steady rhythm of his life. Little did he know, change was already on its way. It was a late autumn afternoon when the first hint of change arrived. The sky was painted in hues of orange and gold, the air crisp with the promise of an early winter. Ethan had just finished fixing the community center's boiler when he heard his name being called. Turning, he saw Jack Sullivan, his closest friend, approaching him with a grin. Jack was the town's resident storyteller, always full of anecdotes and lively opinions. While Ethan was reserved, Jack was the opposite, charismatic, always ready to strike up a conversation with anyone. The two had been friends since childhood, their contrasting personalities balancing each other out. "You coming to the Rusty Lantern tonight?" Jack asked, referring to the town's only bar, a cozy little establishment known for its good company and even better whiskey. Ethan wiped his hands on his work jeans and shook his head. "Long day. Think I'll just head home." Jack rolled his eyes. "You say that every night. You need to get out more, Ethan. One of these days, something's gonna come along and shake up that boring routine of yours." Ethan smirked. I like my routine. Jack chuckled, slapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Famous last words, my friend. Ethan dismissed it with a shake of his head, unaware of how prophetic Jack's words would turn out to be. Because that very evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, something, or rather, someone, was about to enter Ethan Harper's life in the most unexpected way. As Ethan drove home, the quiet town seemed even stiller than usual. The winding road that led to his cabin was lined with trees, their leaves a fiery red, rustling gently in the evening breeze. He was just about to turn onto his driveway when he noticed something unusual, a lone car, parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking in the dim light. Ethan slowed his truck to a stop, peering through the windshield. A woman stood beside the car, arms crossed against the cold, looking visibly frustrated. The hood of the car was propped open, and even from a distance, Ethan could tell she was stranded. A small part of him considered driving past. He wasn't the type to pry into other people's business, and for all he knew, she might have already called for help. But something about the way she stood there, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the empty road, made him pause. With a quiet sigh, Ethan pulled over, stepping out of his truck and into the chilly evening air. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The woman turned to face him, her expression shifting from frustration to relief. "Oh, thank God. I thought I was going to be stuck here all night." Ethan glanced at the car, then back at her. She was dressed in professional attire, her dark coat wrapped tightly around her, strands of auburn hair escaping from a loose bun. There was something refined about her, something that seemed out of place on this empty stretch of road. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. She exhaled sharply. "Flat tire. I have a spare, but I have no idea how to change it." Ethan nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. "Lucky for you, I do." As he moved to retrieve the spare tire from her trunk, he could feel her eyes on him, studying him curiously. And just like that, with the turn of a wrench and the quiet exchange of words between two strangers, the first thread of something unexpected wove itself into Ethan Harper's life. What he didn't know yet was that this chance encounter, this simple act of helping a stranger on the side of the road, would set off a chain of events that would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about his town, and about the quiet life he had built. Because Grace Donovan wasn't just any stranded traveler. And Maple Creek was about to become the center of a much bigger story. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the crisp scent of autumn leaves as Ethan Harper tightened the last lug nut on the spare tire. The stranded woman, Grace Donovan, stood beside him, arms wrapped tightly around herself to keep warm. Though the night had settled in, the headlights of her car cast a glow over them, illuminating the quiet stretch of road where fate had brought them together. "That should do it," Ethan said, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag from his truck. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Just happened to be passing by. Lucky timing." Grace studied him for a moment. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel safe. "Well, I appreciate it. I was starting to think I'd have to walk all the way into town." Ethan glanced down the road. The nearest house was at least a mile away, and the thought of her walking alone in the cold didn't sit right with him. "Where were you headed?" "Just passing through," she said, though her hesitation was noticeable. "Had a bit of business in Maple Creek?" Ethan nodded, deciding not to pry. People came through town all the time, though something about her didn't fit the usual mold of travelers. She seemed too polished, too careful with her words. "Your tire should hold up fine," Ethan said, stepping back. "But you might want to get it checked at the auto shop in town." Grace smiled, a little warmer this time. "I will." "Really, thank you, Ethan." He blinked in surprise. "I don't remember mentioning my name." Grace's expression faltered for a second, then she laughed lightly. "It's a small town. I heard the guy at the community center mention you earlier when I was asking for directions." Ethan nodded, though something about her explanation felt slightly off. He decided not to dwell on it. "Safe travels, Grace." She hesitated before stepping toward her car. "Would you mind if I followed you back to town? Just in case something else goes wrong." Ethan considered for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, sure. I'll take it slow so you can keep up." With that, he climbed back into his truck and started down the road, glancing in his rearview mirror as Grace followed close behind. The town lights soon appeared in the distance, a beacon of warmth against the cold night. They pulled up outside the small auto shop, which had long since closed for the night. Grace parked beside him and got out, rubbing her arms against the chill. "Looks like I'll have to come back in the morning." Ethan nodded. "There's a diner up the street. You can warm up there." She hesitated. "Actually, I don't really know where I'm staying tonight. I was planning on driving a bit further, but..." Ethan sighed internally. He wasn't the type to invite strangers into his world, but something about the way she looked, lost, uncertain, made it hard to walk away. "There's a small inn down the road. Mrs. Callahan runs it. She's got a few rooms open most of the time." Grace smiled gratefully. "That sounds perfect." Ethan nodded and gave her a small wave before heading back to his truck. "Good night, Grace." She watched him for a moment before responding. "Good night, Ethan." As he drove away, something in the back of his mind told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And he had no idea just how right he was. The following morning, Ethan Harper awoke with an unusual sense of unease. He couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the encounter with Grace Donovan the night before. Or maybe it was just the changing seasons. Autumn was giving way to winter, and the air had a distinct bite to it now. Shaking off the feeling, Ethan dressed in his usual work jeans and flannel shirt before stepping outside. His old truck sat right where he'd left it, a thin layer of frost coating the windshield. But something else caught his attention, a sleek black SUV parked down the street, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. Ethan narrowed his eyes. He knew every car in Maple Creek, and this one wasn't familiar. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you usually saw in town, where pickup trucks and beat-up sedans dominated the roads. He pushed the thought aside for the moment and climbed into his truck, turning the ignition. As he pulled away, his gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. The SUV didn't move, but it might as well have been watching him. By the time he arrived at the community center, Ethan had almost convinced himself the SUV was just a coincidence. Maybe a lost tourist or a city dweller who took a wrong turn and decided to stop for breakfast. But the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. Jack Sullivan was already at the center when Ethan arrived. The two of them had been friends for years, and while Jack had a tendency to pry into Ethan's business, he was one of the few people Ethan trusted. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jack commented as Ethan walked in. Ethan grunted in response and set his toolbox down near the boiler he had planned to fix that morning. Jack leaned against the wall, studying him. "All right, spill it." Ethan sighed. "Saw a black SUV parked outside my house this morning. Didn't recognize it." Jack's expression turned serious. "Black SUV? You sure?" "Yeah. Fancy-looking thing, too. Tinted windows." Jack scratched his chin. "That's not exactly normal for Maple Creek. You think it has something to do with that woman you helped last night?" Ethan hadn't wanted to make that connection, but now that Jack had said it out loud, it felt obvious. "I don't know," he admitted. "But something about her was off. She didn't act like a tourist passing through. And she knew my name before I told her." Jack let out a low whistle. "That's enough to make a guy paranoid. Think she's in some kind of trouble?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know. But if she is, I have a feeling I just stepped into something I wasn't supposed to." That evening, Ethan tried to put the encounter out of his mind, but as he drove home, he felt it again, that sensation of being watched. When he turned onto his street, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. The black SUV was still there. Same spot. Same eerie stillness. Ethan slowed his truck, pulling into his driveway but not getting out immediately. Instead, he sat there, watching the vehicle, waiting to see if it would move. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finally, he climbed out of his truck and walked up to his porch, casting one last glance toward the SUV. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. And he had the sinking feeling that he was about to find out just how deep this mystery ran. Ethan Harper was not a man who easily rattled, but as he sat on his porch that evening, sipping his coffee and keeping a watchful eye on the black SUV parked down the street, he felt an unease settle deep in his bones. Something about this wasn't right. And he had a feeling he was about to find out exactly why. Morning came, and the SUV was gone. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to think it had all been in his head, that maybe it really was just some lost traveler who had moved on. But when he arrived at the local diner later that day, the feeling of being watched returned. The Maple Creek Diner was a staple of the town, where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like a sore thumb. So when Ethan walked in and saw two unfamiliar men sitting at the back booth, he knew immediately that they weren't locals. They were dressed sharply, dark suits, crisp white shirts, the kind of attire that didn't belong in a place like Maple Creek. One of them was older, silver-haired and composed, his posture perfect. The other was younger, stockier, with a sharp gaze that never stopped scanning the room. Their presence sent a ripple of tension through the normally laid-back diner. Ethan took a seat at the counter, trying to ignore the way the men's eyes flickered toward him. He ordered his usual coffee, but before he could take a sip, the older man stood and approached him. "Mr. Harper?" The man's voice was calm, measured. Ethan looked up from his coffee. "Depends who's asking." The man extended a hand. "Henry Morris. This is my associate, George Thomas. We'd like to have a word, if you don't mind." Ethan didn't shake his hand. Instead, he studied the two men. Their suits, their polished demeanor, everything about them screamed money, power, influence. "I'm listening," Ethan said evenly. Henry Morris gave a polite smile. "We represent the Morris family. You may be familiar with the name." Ethan's jaw tensed. Of course, he knew the name. The Morris family was one of the wealthiest in the state, old money, with deep roots in politics and business. Their influence stretched far beyond Maple Creek. "What's a family like that want with a guy like me?" Ethan asked, setting his coffee down. Henry's smile didn't falter. "It's about Grace Donovan." Ethan's grip tightened on the ceramic mug. He had known, deep down, that this had something to do with her. The way she had hesitated when she spoke, the way she had known his name, there had been something she wasn't telling him. "What about her?" Ethan asked, his voice careful. George Thomas, the younger of the two, leaned forward slightly. "You did a good deed last night, Mr. Harper. Helped a woman in need. That kind of kindness doesn't go unnoticed." Ethan didn't like the way he said it. Like there was more to it than that. Like it wasn't just kindness they were talking about. Henry Morris's expression remained neutral. "The Morris family is grateful for what you did. We'd like to offer you something in return. A reward, if you will." Ethan's stomach twisted. This was what they wanted? To pay him off? "I don't need a reward," he said flatly. Henry tilted his head slightly, as if he found Ethan's response interesting. "Perhaps not. But we insist." George reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, setting it on the counter. "Consider it a token of appreciation. No strings attached." Ethan didn't touch the envelope. He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he looked at the two men, his instinct screaming that there was more to this than just gratitude. "I'm not interested," he said, standing from his seat. "Now if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." Henry Morris remained calm, sipping his coffee as if Ethan's rejection hadn't fazed him in the slightest. But George Thomas wasn't as composed. He stood as well, his stance tense, as if he wasn't used to people turning down their offers. "Think about it, Mr. Harper," Henry said, still seated. "This is a generous offer. Most wouldn't refuse." "I'm not most people," Ethan replied, his voice steady. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the envelope untouched on the counter. But as he stepped onto the street, a nagging feeling told him that this wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Ethan Harper had spent his life trusting his gut instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. The encounter with Henry Morris and George Thomas at the diner had left him with more questions than answers. Their polished words, the envelope full of money, the deliberate calm in Henry's voice, it all pointed to something bigger than just gratitude. And then there was Grace Donovan. Or rather, Grace Morris. Ethan drove home in silence, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. He wasn't one to get involved in things that weren't his business, but something told him that, whether he liked it or not, he was already in the middle of this mess. When he pulled up to his house, the last thing he expected was to see Grace standing on his porch, arms wrapped around herself as though shielding against the cool evening air. She turned as he climbed out of his truck, relief flashing across her face. "I was hoping you'd be home." Ethan took his time walking up to her, his gaze unreadable. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Grace exhaled and glanced over her shoulder as if making sure they were alone. "Can we talk inside?" Ethan hesitated. The last thing he needed was more trouble, but he could see it in her eyes, she was scared. Finally, he nodded and opened the door, stepping aside so she could enter. The inside of his house was simple, just like everything else in his life. A well-worn couch sat against the far wall, a small kitchen to the right, and a few framed photographs of his parents on a shelf. Grace stood in the middle of the living room, shifting from foot to foot as though trying to decide where to begin. "They found you," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "The men from this morning. Henry Morris and George Thomas." Grace's expression tightened. "I know. That's why I'm here. They can't know I spoke to you." Ethan crossed his arms. "Then maybe you should start by telling me who they really are. And why a couple of rich men are so interested in what happened last night." Grace swallowed hard and lowered herself onto the couch, her fingers gripping the fabric as if grounding herself. "Ethan, my real name isn't Grace Donovan. It's Grace Morris. Henry Morris is my uncle." Ethan had suspected she was connected to them, but hearing it confirmed still sent a wave of realization through him. "So, you're part of that family. The Morris family." She nodded. "My father is Richard Morris. He owns, well, practically everything. Businesses, properties, politicians. You name it, he controls it. And that's exactly why I had to leave." Ethan sat down in the chair across from her, his gaze sharp. "Why? What are you running from?" Grace's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "My father has enemies, Ethan. Powerful ones. A few weeks ago, I discovered something I wasn't supposed to. I don't know all the details, but I found evidence of financial dealings that weren't just unethical, they were illegal. When I confronted him about it, he didn't take it well. He told me to forget what I saw. But I couldn't. So, I ran." Ethan leaned forward. "And now they're trying to bring you back?" She nodded. "Not out of concern. Out of control. My father doesn't like loose ends. And if Henry and George are here, it means they think I might have told someone. They don't know what I've done, but they're trying to contain the damage." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And now I'm caught up in it." Grace's eyes filled with regret. "I never meant for that to happen. But when you stopped to help me last night, you put yourself on their radar. And now, I don't know what they'll do to you." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had spent his life keeping things simple, staying out of trouble. But now, because of one act of kindness, he was standing in the crosshairs of a powerful family that didn't like being questioned. "You should leave town," he said finally. "Go somewhere they won't find you." Grace shook her head. "It's too late for that. If they think I've talked, they won't stop looking. And if you're in their sights now, running won't help either." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. This wasn't his fight, but he couldn't just throw her to the wolves. "So what do we do?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "We find out what they're hiding. And we make sure they can't cover it up." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. He had no business going up against men like Henry Morris, but one thing was clear, Grace was done running. And if he didn't help her, he had a feeling she wouldn't make it out of this alive. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Tell me everything you know. We'll figure this out together." The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure, Ethan Harper's quiet life in Maple Creek was over. Ethan Harper sat in silence, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the woman across from him. Grace Morris. Not Grace Donovan. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He had lived a quiet life, free of entanglements, but now, in less than 24 hours, he found himself thrust into something much bigger than he ever could have anticipated. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled sharply. "So let me get this straight, you ran from your father because you found out he was involved in something illegal, and now they're trying to track you down. And because I stopped to help you on the side of the road, they think I might know something." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes. And I wish I could say they'd let it go, but they won't. My father doesn't like loose ends. If they think you could be a threat, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you stay quiet." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. He had spent his entire life avoiding trouble. He wasn't a fighter, wasn't someone who got tangled up in things he couldn't control. But this? This was way out of his depth. "And what happens if I just tell them I don't know anything?" Ethan asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Grace hesitated before answering. "They won't believe you. And even if they did, they might still see you as a liability. My father has a lot of influence. If he wants you out of the picture, he'll find a way." Ethan clenched his jaw. The thought of someone deciding his fate without his input made his blood boil. He had worked hard for his quiet, simple life, and now, through no fault of his own, it was being threatened. He could feel the walls of his carefully built world beginning to crack. "You should leave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Get as far away from here as possible. If you disappear, maybe they'll stop looking." Grace shook her head. "I tried running once, Ethan. It didn't work. If I disappear again, they'll just keep looking. The only way to stop this is to face it head on." Ethan frowned. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Go back and beg for forgiveness? Hope your father has a change of heart." "No," Grace said, her voice steady. "I need to expose him. Whatever he's involved in, whatever he's trying to cover up, I have to bring it into the light. It's the only way to make sure he can't keep doing this." Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. "That sounds real noble and all, but let's be realistic. Your father is a billionaire. He has power, connections, people willing to do his dirty work. How do you plan to take someone like that down?" Grace met his gaze, unwavering. "I don't know yet. But I do know that I can't do it alone." Ethan sighed, standing up and pacing the room. This wasn't his fight. He barely knew Grace, and now she was asking him to go up against one of the most powerful men in the country. Everything in him told him to walk away, to let her figure this out on her own and go back to his quiet life. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he did that. He had helped her once. Turning his back on her now wasn't something he could do in good conscience. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "If I help you, it's on my terms. We do this smart, careful. No reckless moves. No running headfirst into danger." Grace nodded quickly, relief washing over her features. "Of course. I wouldn't expect anything else." Ethan ran a hand down his face. "All right then. First things first, we need to figure out exactly what you found. If we're going up against your father, we need proof. Real proof." Grace reached into the bag she had brought with her, pulling out a small, worn notebook. "I started taking notes when I first became suspicious. I don't have everything, but there are names, dates, and transaction records that didn't add up. If I can get access to more of his documents, we might have enough to go public." Ethan frowned. "And where exactly do you plan on getting those?" She hesitated. "My father has a private estate not far from here. It's heavily secured, but I know a way in. If I can get to his office, I might be able to find what we need." Ethan let out a long breath. This just keeps getting better and better. He sat back down, rubbing his hands together as he thought. He had been prepared for a quiet night, but now he was planning a way to help a billionaire's runaway daughter expose a criminal operation. His life had taken a turn he never could have predicted. Finally, he looked at her again. "All right, Grace. I'll help you. But we do this my way. And if things go south, you listen to me. Understood?" She nodded. "Understood." Ethan stood up, his decision made. There was no going back now. He had stepped into something dangerous, something bigger than himself. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let Grace face it alone. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. Ethan Harper wasn't a man who made impulsive decisions. His life had been built on careful choices, on staying out of trouble, on minding his own business. But now, he was standing on the edge of something big, something dangerous. And he wasn't sure if he was making the right call. So he did the one thing he always did when life threw him into uncertainty. He sought advice from the one person he trusted most. Jack Sullivan had been Ethan's best friend since childhood. The two had grown up together, gotten into their fair share of mischief, and weathered life's storms side by side. If there was anyone who could give Ethan clarity, it was Jack. Ethan drove to Jack's house, a modest, well-kept place near the outskirts of Maple Creek. Jack was out on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the morning sun rise over the hills when Ethan pulled up. He raised an eyebrow as Ethan stepped out of his truck. "You look like a man with a problem," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "Come on up. Coffee's fresh." Ethan climbed the steps and sat in the chair across from him. He rubbed his hands together, trying to find the right words. "I need your take on something." Jack took a slow sip of coffee. "I'm listening." Ethan exhaled. "You ever hear of Richard Morris?" Jack's expression darkened slightly. "Yeah. Everyone has. The guy's a kingmaker. Got his hands in politics, business, you name it. Nothing happens in this state without his say-so." "Why?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. "His daughter's in trouble. She found something she wasn't supposed to, and now he wants to bring her back, by force if necessary. I got caught up in it. Jack set his coffee down, studying him carefully. Caught up how? I helped her when she was stranded, Ethan admitted. Didn't know who she was at the time. Now, her father's people have taken an interest in me. And she's asking for my help to expose whatever he's covering up. Jack let out a low whistle. Damn, Ethan. You don't do things halfway, do you? Ethan shook his head. I don't know if I'm making a mistake here. This isn't my fight, but if I walk away, I know what's going to happen to her. And I can't live with that. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, man, I get it. You've always been the guy who does the right thing, even when it's hard. But this is dangerous. Richard Morris doesn't play fair. If you go up against him, you better be ready for a war. Ethan nodded. That's what I'm afraid of. Jack was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. If you do this, you need a plan. You need to be smarter than him, not just braver. You can't just walk into this blind. I know, Ethan said. That's why I came to you. Jack sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. All right. First thing, what does she have? Evidence? Something concrete? Ethan nodded. Some notes, transaction records she thinks are suspicious. But nothing definitive. She says she can get more if she gets into her father's office. Jack frowned. That's risky. High security, people watching. If she gets caught? Yeah, Ethan said. Which is why we need to be careful. Jack stood up and walked to the railing, staring out at the fields beyond. You're asking me what I think? I think you're stepping into a hornet's nest. But I also know you won't back down now. So if you're going to do this, do it right. Get proof. Real proof. And don't trust anyone outside of us. Ethan exhaled. I was hoping you'd say that. Jack smirked. Course you were. That's why you came to me. Ethan stood and clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. Thanks. Jack nodded, his expression serious. One more thing, Ethan, if this goes sideways, if things get dangerous, you need to be ready to walk away. No matter what. Promise me that. Ethan hesitated before nodding. I promise. Jack didn't look convinced, but he let it go. All right. Let's get to work. Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little. He wasn't alone in this. And if he was going to go up against the Morris family, he was going to do it the right way. Because now, there was no turning back. Ethan Harper had never considered himself a reckless man. He took pride in thinking things through, weighing the risks, and acting only when he was certain of his course. But this was uncharted territory. He was up against forces far greater than anything he had ever encountered, and no amount of preparation could guarantee his safety, or Grace's. Back at his cabin, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the worn notebook Grace had handed him. Pages filled with names, dates, and numbers that meant little to him but everything to the people hunting her. He turned the pages slowly, searching for something, anything, that might give them an advantage. Grace sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, eyes scanning his face. What are you thinking? Ethan sighed. I'm thinking Jack was right. This is a hornet's nest, and I just kicked it. She lowered her gaze. If you want out, I understand. I never should have dragged you into this. Ethan exhaled and leaned forward. It's too late for that. I made my choice the second I stopped to help you. Now, we just have to make sure we don't end up buried because of it. A flicker of relief crossed Grace's face, but she remained tense. I know I'm asking for a lot. But I don't have anyone else. I can't do this alone. Ethan nodded. I know. And I won't let you. The words settled between them, solidifying his decision. He was in this now, whether he liked it or not. The only thing left to do was find a way to turn the tide in their favor. He tapped a finger against the notebook. You said you think your father keeps more detailed records somewhere. Something solid. Something that would expose him. Grace nodded. Yes. He keeps everything important at his private estate. He has a study there, locked, monitored, heavily secured. But if we can get inside, I know where to look. Ethan frowned. That's a big if. You sneaking into the Morris estate is like walking into a lion's den. You sure about this? It's the only way, she said firmly. If we don't have concrete proof, this will all be for nothing. My father has the power to bury rumors, even strong accusations. But if we find real evidence, something undeniable, we can take him down. Ethan ran a hand over his face. All right. If we're doing this, we need a plan. A good one. And we need Jack. Grace hesitated. Do you think we can trust him? Ethan didn't hesitate. Jack's the best man I know. If anyone can help us navigate this, it's him. Grace nodded, though worry still lingered in her eyes. Then we should move quickly. The longer we wait, the more time they have to tighten security. Ethan grabbed his jacket. Let's go. Jack needs to hear this. They drove in silence to Jack's place, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Jack was already waiting on the porch, as if he had expected them. He took one look at Ethan's expression and shook his head. So, you're really doing this, Jack said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. We are. And we need your help. Jack exhaled and leaned against the porch railing. You sure about this, man? Once we go down this road, there's no coming back. I know, Ethan said. But I can't walk away. Not now. Jack studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right. Let's figure out how to make this work. Ethan and Grace stepped onto the porch, and as the three of them stood there, discussing their next move, Ethan felt something shift. For the first time since this all started, he wasn't just reacting, he was taking control. And he had a feeling that, one way or another, nothing would ever be the same again. The plan was reckless. Ethan knew that. But as he sat across from Jack in his dimly lit living room, mapping out every possible angle, he realized there was no way to do this safely. No way to bring down Richard Morris without walking into danger. The only thing they could do was prepare, move smartly, and minimize the risk. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Breaking into the Morris estate isn't exactly a weekend adventure, Ethan. The place is locked down tighter than a bank vault. Security cameras, guards, motion sensors, hell, for all we know, the walls might be electrified. Grace, sitting beside Ethan, tensed at Jack's words. I know it's dangerous, but I also know my father's habits. He trusts his security system more than his people. That's his weakness. He assumes no one would dare try to get inside. Jack frowned. That's a big assumption to gamble on. Ethan studied Grace, noticing the determination in her eyes. She's right. If Richard's arrogance is as big as his reputation, we can use it against him. But we need a solid strategy. Jack sighed. All right. Let's break it down. Grace, you said you know where he keeps his records. Yes. His private office, second floor, west wing. It's locked, but I know the passcode. At least, I think I do. He changes it periodically, but he's predictable. He cycles between a few different codes, and I have a list of them. Jack raised an eyebrow. You memorized your father's security codes? Grace smirked slightly. Let's just say growing up in that house taught me a few survival skills. Ethan nodded. All right, so getting into the office is step one. What about getting onto the property without being seen? Jack stood and walked to the window, staring outside as he thought. The estate is massive, surrounded by forest on three sides. If we come in through the backwoods, we avoid the main entrance. The only problem is the perimeter guards. They patrol every hour. We'd have to time it perfectly. Grace leaned forward. There's a service entrance near the greenhouse. It's usually unmanned at night. If we can reach that without being spotted, we can slip inside. Ethan exhaled. That's a lot of IFS. Jack nodded. Yeah, it is. But it's our best shot. If we're going to do this, we need disguises, a getaway plan, and a backup plan in case things go south. Grace swallowed hard. I can get us inside. But we have to be careful. If my father finds out we're there, he won't just try to stop us. He'll destroy us. The weight of her words settled over them like a thick fog. Ethan knew what was at stake. He had always been a man of integrity, a man who avoided unnecessary risks. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about Grace's freedom. About exposing a man who had controlled too many lives for too long. Then we don't fail, Ethan said firmly. We do this right, and we do it fast. The following night, they moved. Dressed in dark clothing, Ethan, Grace, and Jack made their way through the dense trees bordering the Morris estate. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, shrouding them in darkness. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. Ethan led the way, his senses sharp. Years of working on machinery had given him a keen awareness of sound, of movement. He could hear the faint crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the distant murmur of the wind through the trees. Every now and then, he glanced back at Grace, making sure she was still steady. Jack held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He pointed ahead where two guards stood near a side entrance, chatting quietly. Their rifles were slung over their shoulders, their post relaxed. Ethan and Jack exchanged a look. Timing was everything. The guards eventually moved, disappearing around the corner. That was their window. Ethan gestured for Grace to move quickly. They darted across the open space, reaching the service entrance just as Jack eased the door open. It creaked slightly, but no alarm sounded. They slipped inside, pressing against the walls as they adjusted to the dim interior. "West Wing," Grace whispered, leading the way. The house smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, an overwhelming contrast to the wild earthiness outside. The floors were pristine, the air heavy with silence. Every shadow felt like a threat. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the staircase. They moved quickly, sticking close to the wall, avoiding the security cameras Grace had memorized. The hallway stretched before them, leading to a grand door at the far end. Grace reached into her pocket, pulling out a slip of paper with numbers scribbled on it. She hesitated. "If the code's changed, we're in trouble." Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Try it." She exhaled sharply and punched in the first set of numbers. The lock clicked open. Jack let out a breath of relief. "Lucky us." They slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them. The office was massive, lined with towering bookshelves and an ornate wooden desk. A safe sat against the far wall. Grace rushed to the desk, rifling through papers, searching for anything useful. Ethan moved to the safe, running his fingers along the dial. "Can you open this?" Grace nodded. "It'll take a minute." Jack positioned himself near the door, listening for movement. "Make it quick." Grace's fingers moved skillfully over the lock, her breath steady despite the tension. The safe gave a soft click, and she exhaled in relief, swinging it open. Inside were stacks of documents, USB drives, and folders marked with legal seals. "Jackpot," Ethan muttered. Grace grabbed everything she could, stuffing papers into her bag. "This is it. This is what we need." A sudden noise froze them. Footsteps. Coming fast. Jack cursed. "We need to move. Now." Ethan grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her toward the door just as it burst open. A guard stood there, eyes widening in shock. "Hey!" Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming his fist into the man's jaw. The guard stumbled, but another was already shouting down the hall. "Go!" Jack shouted, shoving them forward. They ran, their cover blown, their time up. The halls blurred as they sprinted toward the exit. Security alarms blared, voices yelling behind them. The estate was waking up. Bursting out of the service door, they barely had time to register the headlights flashing in the driveway. "Cut!" Jack yelled, pointing to where their escape vehicle was hidden. Ethan and Grace dove into the back seat as Jack slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. Behind them, the Morris estate loomed, guards scrambling, lights flashing. They had what they came for. But now, they were fugitives. And Richard Morris would be coming for them. The car sped down the narrow backroads, the night air thick with tension. Ethan gripped the seat as Jack maneuvered around sharp curves, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. No headlights in sight, but that wouldn't last. The Morris family didn't let things go unanswered. "We need to get off the main roads," Jack muttered, hands tight on the wheel. "They'll be looking for us." Grace, sitting in the back seat beside Ethan, clutched the bag of stolen documents. She was breathing heavily, her hands shaking. "We did it. We actually did it." Ethan wasn't so sure. "We got out, but they know we were there. That means they'll be coming after us. We need to figure out our next move." Jack nodded, veering off onto a hidden dirt path leading into the dense woods. "I know a place where we can lay low. But we don't have long before they put the pieces together." The car jolted as it hit an uneven patch, bouncing them all in their seats. Ethan turned to Grace. "Go through those files. We need to know what we have." Grace fumbled with the documents, flipping through them quickly. "There are bank statements, offshore accounts, business transactions, some of them don't make sense. But this?" She held up a printed email thread, her face paling as she read it. "Oh my God." Ethan leaned closer. "What?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "My father's paying off officials. Judges, senators, he's got people in his pocket. These documents prove it. If this gets out, it could destroy him." Jack let out a low whistle. So we've got something worth running for. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then we need to be smart about how we use it. We can't just throw this out there, we need to make sure it lands in the right hands. Jack made a sharp turn, pulling into an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. He killed the engine, shrouding them in silence. We stay here for the night. We move at first light. Ethan opened the car door and stepped out, scanning the area. It was quiet, too quiet. His gut told him they weren't safe yet. Grace still held the papers tightly. Ethan, if my father knows we have this, he won't just try to scare us. He'll try to silence us permanently. Ethan met her gaze, seeing the fear in her eyes. Then we don't give him the chance. We go on the offensive. Jack snorted. You got a plan for that? Because I'm pretty sure we're 3 people against an empire. Ethan took the documents from Grace and flipped through them. We need to get these to the right people. Someone who can actually take Morris down. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's easier said than done. You can't just walk into a police station with this kind of thing. We need someone untouchable. Grace looked down at the files, her mind racing. I know someone. An investigative journalist, Lena Carter. She's been after my father for years. If we get this to her, she'll make sure the world sees it. Jack looked skeptical. And you trust her? More than anyone else, Grace said firmly. If we can get to her, we stand a chance. Ethan nodded. Then that's our play. First light, we find Lena Carter. The tension settled between them, the weight of their choices pressing down. They weren't just running anymore, they were fighting back. As Ethan sat in the quiet of the barn, listening to the distant wind, he realized something. They had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. And Richard Morris was about to find out what happened when people stopped being afraid of him. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the barn's wooden walls, casting long shadows over the 3 fugitives. Jack was the first awake, stretching his arms before nudging Ethan, who had barely slept. Grace stirred next, her hand still gripping the bag of stolen documents as if afraid they'd disappear in the night. Ethan rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stood, stretching his sore muscles. We need to move. If Morris's people are looking for us, they'll start with every hideout near town. Jack cracked his knuckles. Yeah, I don't like staying put either. So where's this Lena Carter based? Grace zipped open the bag, pulling out a business card. She's based in the city, about 4 hours from here. If we can get there without being caught, she'll take care of the rest. Ethan nodded. Then we keep a low profile, take the back roads, and stay out of sight. The last thing we need is the cops sniffing around. Jack scoffed. Speaking of which, there's something else we need to worry about. Mayor Thomas Bradford. Grace frowned. The mayor? What does he have to do with this? Jack folded his arms. Bradford's as crooked as they come. He's in Morris's pocket, and if Morris wants us found, guess who's going to be helping him? If we try to leave town and Bradford gets wind of it, every cop in the county will be stopping us. Ethan let out a deep breath, frustration gnawing at him. So we don't just have Morris's men after us, we have law enforcement too. Pretty much, Jack said. Which means driving out of here just got a hell of a lot riskier. Grace's expression hardened. If Bradford is working with my father, he's covering up more than just our escape. He's protecting corruption. That means there's a way to expose him, too. Jack gave her a skeptical look. You want to take down a billionaire and a mayor at the same time? You got a death wish. I don't care about the risk, Grace shot back. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep getting away with it. And we'll be running forever. Ethan considered their options. He was a man of action, but he wasn't reckless. They needed to be smart about this. All right, let's split this into steps. First, we get out of town. Then we expose Morris. And if we can take Bradford down in the process, even better. Jack nodded. Sounds great. But how do we get past the police roadblocks without drawing attention? Grace tapped her fingers on the bag, thinking. We need a distraction. Something big enough to pull their attention away from us. Jack's lips curled into a slow grin. You leave that to me. I know just the thing. Half an hour later, Ethan, Grace, and Jack crouched behind an old gas station on the outskirts of town, watching the sheriff's station through a pair of binoculars. Jack smirked. All right, folks, watch and learn. From a distance, an explosion shattered the morning silence. A massive fireball erupted behind the town's courthouse, sending smoke billowing into the sky. Alarm bells rang, and within moments, squad cars tore away from the sheriff's station, heading straight toward the chaos. Ethan gave Jack a sharp look. "What the hell did you do?" Jack shrugged innocently. "Just a little diversion. Don't worry, no one got hurt. Just a gas leak at the right place at the right time." Grace's eyes were wide, but she quickly shook off the shock. "Then we don't waste time. Let's go." With the town distracted, the three of them slipped into Ethan's truck and took off down an empty side road, the city skyline calling them forward. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. The fight had just begun. The truck roared down the empty back road, gravel kicking up in their wake. Ethan kept his grip tight on the wheel, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The town of Maple Creek was now just a silhouette in the distance, but he knew better than to think they were safe. "Jack, you sure that explosion isn't going to bring the entire county down on us?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Jack smirked from the passenger seat. "Relax. It was just enough to cause a commotion. No one got hurt, but it gave us the window we needed." Grace shifted in her seat, still clutching the bag of stolen documents as if it were a lifeline. "We need to make sure we don't run into roadblocks. My father has resources. If he wants us stopped, he can make sure the state police get involved." Ethan nodded. "Then we stay off the highways. We'll stick to the county roads until we get close to the city." Jack glanced back at Grace. "This journalist of yours, Lena Carter. You trust her?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "She's been investigating my father for years. She just never had enough proof to bring him down. If we get these files to her, she'll know what to do." Jack leaned back. "All right then. Let's hope she's ready for what's coming." For the next few hours, they drove in silence, only stopping once to switch cars. Jack had arranged for them to swap their truck for a nondescript sedan at an abandoned farm. It was an old trick, but one that might buy them time before Morris's men caught up. As Ethan drove, his mind raced. This wasn't just about Grace anymore. This was about stopping a man who had his fingers in everything corrupt about the system. Ethan had spent his life avoiding trouble, but now he was in the thick of it. And he wasn't about to back down. Jack finally broke the silence. "We're about 30 miles out. If we're gonna hit trouble, it'll be soon." As if on cue, Grace's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "It's from an unknown number?" Jack looked at Ethan. "Could be her father." Ethan nodded. "Put it on speaker." Grace hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A familiar voice filled the car. "Grace. You need to stop this." Grace's grip on the phone tightened. "Dad?" Richard Morris's voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Come home. We can talk about this. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." Grace's eyes filled with anger. "No, you don't understand. I know everything now. And I'm not letting you get away with it." There was a pause, then Richard sighed. "Grace, I'm disappointed. I didn't want it to come to this, but you're forcing my hand. If you keep running, you won't like what happens next." Ethan clenched his jaw. "If you so much as think about hurting her, I'll make sure you go down harder than you ever imagined." There was another pause before Richard chuckled. "And you must be Ethan Harper, the Good Samaritan. You have no idea what you're up against, do you?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I know enough. And I know your time's running out." Richard's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "You should have stayed out of this, Harper. Now you're in over your head." The call ended. Grace exhaled shakily, lowering the phone. "He's not bluffing. He'll do whatever it takes to stop us." Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened. "Let him try. We're finishing this." The city skyline appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set. It was a sharp contrast to the quiet countryside they had left behind. Skyscrapers loomed over the streets, their windows glowing in the fading light. The air felt charged with anticipation. Jack directed Ethan to an underground parking garage beneath an old newspaper building. "This is it. Lena's office is upstairs." They parked and made their way inside, taking a freight elevator up to the third floor. The office was small but cluttered, walls covered in newspaper clippings and pinned-up notes. A woman sat behind a desk, typing furiously on a laptop. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Grace Morris. This is unexpected." Grace stepped forward. "Lena, I have everything you need." "The proof?" "All of it." Lena Carter stood, studying them carefully. Then she gestured to the bag. "Show me." Grace opened the bag, spreading the documents across the desk. Lena scanned them quickly, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a low whistle. Damn. This is enough to bury him. If I publish this, Richard Morris is done. Ethan crossed his arms. Then we need to move fast. He knows we're here. He's already threatened us. Lena nodded. I'll get my team on this immediately. But you three, you're not safe here. If Morris knows you're in the city, he'll send people after you. Jack smirked. Wouldn't be the first time. Lena sighed. I have a safe house outside the city. You stay there until we go public. Once this hits the media, he won't be able to touch you without making things worse for himself. Ethan looked at Grace, then Jack. Then that's the plan. Lena picked up her phone and started making calls. Give me a few hours. When this goes live, there's no going back. Ethan felt the weight of everything settle on his shoulders. They were at the finish line, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. Now, it was a waiting game. And Richard Morris wasn't going to go down without a fight. The air inside Lena Carter's office felt thick with tension. Ethan, Grace, and Jack watched as Lena and her team worked tirelessly, scanning documents, verifying sources, and preparing the story that would bring down Richard Morris. The hum of computers and the rapid clicking of keyboards filled the room. The weight of their journey rested on the shoulders of these journalists, and time was running out. Ethan leaned against the desk, arms crossed. How long until this goes live? Lena didn't look up from her screen. A few more hours. I need to double-check everything. If we publish and there's even one hole in the story, Morris will use it to discredit us. We can't afford mistakes. Grace paced near the window, looking down at the city below. We don't have hours. My father's men could already be in the building. Jack, sitting in the corner with his feet propped up, let out a low whistle. Relax, princess. If they wanted to storm the place, they would have done it already. They're waiting to see if they can stop this before it happens. Lena's phone buzzed. She grabbed it, glanced at the screen, then cursed under her breath. Damn it. Ethan tensed. What is it? She showed him the screen, a news alert about a high-ranking police official publicly dismissing claims of corruption in Morris's dealings. It was a preemptive strike. Morris knew they were coming for him, and he was already laying the groundwork to defend himself. He's trying to control the narrative, Lena said, running a hand through her hair. We need to get ahead of this. Ethan clenched his jaw. Then do it. Now. Lena hesitated for only a second before nodding. All right. We go live in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Ethan and Jack kept watch at the door, while Grace hovered near the computer, watching as Lena's team finalized the report. Finally, Lena clicked a button, and the screen changed. It's out. The weight of the moment settled over them. Grace exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the desk. That's it? Just like that? Lena smiled grimly. Just like that? The story is everywhere now. Major outlets will pick it up within minutes. Your father is officially exposed. Jack chuckled. Damn. That's got a sting. Ethan wasn't celebrating yet. He knew Richard Morris wasn't the type to go down quietly. Now we wait. And we prepare for whatever comes next. The wait wasn't long. Less than an hour later, Lena's phone rang. She answered, putting it on speaker. Carter. A deep, familiar voice filled the room. You think you've won. Richard Morris's voice was steady, but beneath it, there was a sharp edge of anger. Grace straightened. It's over, Dad. You can't spin this. The whole world knows the truth now. Morris chuckled coldly. You underestimate me, Grace. Power doesn't just disappear overnight. I still have friends in high places. I still have resources. This story doesn't end here. Ethan spoke up, his voice firm. No, it doesn't. It ends with you behind bars. Morris was silent for a moment. Then, in a lower, more dangerous tone, he said, You have no idea what you've done. I'll make sure every single one of you pays for this. Lena cut in. Threats won't help you now, Richard. The FBI will be knocking on your door any minute. If I were you, I'd start thinking about a deal. Another silence. Then Morris spoke again, this time directly to Grace. You think you're free of me? You'll never be free. Grace's hands clenched into fists. I already am. The call disconnected. Jack exhaled. Well, that was dramatic. Ethan turned to Lena. What happens now? Now? Now we watch the fallout. The authorities will be on him soon. He can try to fight it, but with this level of exposure, his days of untouchable power are over. Grace looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't living in her father's shadow. "We did it." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yeah, we did." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new fight, one for justice, for healing, for whatever came next. The world was watching. Within hours of Lena Carter's story going live, news networks, social media, and major publications flooded their channels with headlines about Richard Morris. His name was dragged through every possible medium: corruption, bribery, threats, and money laundering. The man who had once stood untouchable was now the face of disgrace. Grace, Ethan, and Jack sat in Lena's office, glued to the television as the fallout unfolded in real time. Every major outlet was covering the scandal. Politicians who once praised Richard Morris now distanced themselves from him. Business partners severed ties. Law enforcement agencies publicly announced their investigations. And then, the moment they had been waiting for. An emergency press conference was being broadcast from Washington, D.C. A stern-faced federal official stepped to the podium, papers in hand, cameras flashing wildly. After an extensive review of newly uncovered evidence, federal prosecutors have issued an arrest warrant for Richard Morris. Effective immediately, Morris is under investigation for multiple counts of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit bribery. He will be taken into federal custody pending trial. Grace inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. "It's really happening." Jack let out a slow whistle. "I gotta say, I didn't think we'd live to see this." Ethan watched in silence. This moment, this victory, was everything they had fought for. And yet, a part of him knew the fight wasn't over. Richard Morris was powerful. A man like him wouldn't go down without trying to take as many people with him as he could. Just as that thought crossed his mind, Lena's phone rang. She answered quickly, listening for only a few moments before nodding. "Understood. Thank you." She hung up and turned to them, her face unreadable. "Morris was arrested an hour ago. They picked him up at his estate." "No resistance." Ethan frowned. "That easy?" Lena nodded. "Too easy. Which means he still thinks he has a way out." Grace exhaled. "I don't care. He's in custody. That's all that matters." Jack chuckled. "I wouldn't start celebrating yet. Guys like him? They don't give up. They strike back when you least expect it." Lena nodded in agreement. "We should be careful. He may still have connections who will try to silence this." Ethan leaned forward. "So what do we do now?" Lena smiled grimly. "We make sure this stays in the public eye. The more pressure there is, the less room he has to maneuver." Over the next few weeks, the world kept its eyes on Richard Morris. His lawyers attempted to suppress evidence, but there was too much to ignore. The public demanded accountability. His former allies turned their backs on him. And slowly but surely, his empire crumbled. One morning, as Ethan, Grace, and Jack sat in a quiet diner, a news anchor's voice filled the space. "Richard Morris has officially been denied bail, with prosecutors citing a high flight risk. His assets are frozen pending further investigation. If convicted, Morris could face up to 50 years in federal prison." Grace let out a breath of relief. "He's done?" Ethan studied her, watching the way her shoulders relaxed for the first time since this all began. "What's next for you?" She thought for a moment, then smiled. "I don't know. For the first time in my life, I have a choice. I think I'd like to figure that out." Jack grinned. "And what about you, Harper? You going back to fixing leaky pipes and being the town's most eligible bachelor?" Ethan smirked. "Something like that? Maybe. But I think I've had enough excitement for a while." Grace reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You changed my life, Ethan. I don't think I could have done this without you." He squeezed her hand gently. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you think." Jack sighed dramatically. All right, let's not get too sentimental. Let's just enjoy our breakfast without any explosions, car chases, or death threats." They laughed, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were free. Months later, Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun set over Maple Creek. The quiet was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. Grace had left town, starting fresh in a new city. Lena's career had skyrocketed after breaking the biggest story of the decade. Jack, to no one's surprise, had gone off in search of his next great adventure. And Ethan? He was right where he belonged. He picked up the newspaper from the porch table. The headline read, "Richard Morris sentenced to life in prison." Ethan exhaled, a slow sense of closure washing over him. Justice had prevailed. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt wide open.